My goodness, I think there's quite a buzz in the room. It's quite fun to see how excited everybody is about this conference. And Kelly was just saying to me that she's so impressed with the plenary sessions that she's attended. And I was just saying to her, well, the great thing is you're one of them. Anyway, let me briefly introduce her so that we can get on with this last session of the day. So Kelly Gordon, who is our next speaker, is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at McGill University. Her research interests are primarily in North American politics of gender and political persuasion. She focuses on the conceptions and ideals of gender in conservative political movements in Canada and the United States. In her 2015 book, she argues that the contemporary anti-abortion movement has undergone a considerable transformation in the past decade, a shift that has made the movement's approach to gender quite distinct from that of earlier Canadian and American anti-abortion activists. And that book is titled The Changing Voice of the Anti-Abortion Movement, The Rise of Pro-Woman Rhetoric in Canada and the United States. Her current research examines contemporary gendered and racialized contours of conservatism in Canada and the United States. Her new book project, tentatively entitled Mobilizing Victimhood, Blaming and Claiming the Victim in Contemporary Canadian Conservatism, focuses on the relationship between the politics of victimhood and conservative activist and party politics in Canada. Her research on the anti-abortion movement, incidentally, has been awarded the 2014 McMenemy Prize for the best article in the Canadian Journal of Political Science and the 2016 Donald Smiley Prize for the best book published in the field of Canadian politics. In 2019, she was awarded the Governor General's Medal. So we're very, very fortunate to have Kelly here with us today. And would you join me in giving her a warm welcome?
Thank you. I hate intros so much, and now I'm sweating and feel very nervous. No, I'm so happy to be here today. I'm so happy that you made it to the end of the day. I hope you have your coffees. And I'm also slightly humbled to be here after sort of two amazing plenaries and panel discussions. It's been a really intellectually stimulating day. So I study conservative politics, so I'm spend a lot of my time at conservative events like this. So I'm a regular at the Manning Center Conference, for example, right? So being here is a pleasure, and I'm really happy to be here. I study conservative politics in Canada, and I wasn't really sort of concerned with populism, but if you study conservatism in today's political climate, you inevitably sort of come to this populism question. And so what I'm going to be presenting today is really some sort of preliminary thoughts and some preliminary research about the particular contours that Canadian populism takes. And so that said, I'm actually still in this phase of research where I'm very open to sort of comments. So I mean, I'll extend that to the Q&A as well. And today, my presentation is going to talk about sort of three things about Canadian populism. So first, I'm going to talk about this question of sort of what is populism, right? This is a question that has circulated in this conference, and talk a little bit about sort of how we've come to understand populism in the last decade, and sort of particularly in this contemporary moment. And I'm going to suggest that there's sort of a dominant narrative about populism that has arisen for very good reason, right? That populism is most often centered on ethnonationalism, right? And sort of this mobilization of anti-immigrant sentiments and arguments. The second part of my presentation is going to look at some of the real, in particular, institutional limits to this type of populist rhetoric centered on ethnonationalism. And then the third part, I'm going to present some sort of new research that I've been doing about the contemporary contours, and in particular the rise of what I think is going to become a very salient populist argument in Canada, and that's the rise of penal populism within Conservative Party politics. If I was teaching a class, I would say any questions, but I guess I'll keep going. All right, so what is populism? So I mean, this is a big question, and what's interesting, I've been reading writing a lot about populism lately, is that the literature on populism is actually defined by such a high degree of debate that the very contestability over the concept itself has actually become like a defining feature of the literature. So you go into the literature and they're like, we don't know what populism is, right? It means a lot of different things, right? And so there's been a lot of ink spilled over sort of how we should understand populism, right? Whether we can understand it as being a coherent political ideology, whether it's better understood as a worldview or a rhetorical structure, right? And others have suggested that it's more of a political style, right? Often tied to charismatic figures with bad manners, right? Yeah. So more confusing still, right, is that populism, and this again is particularly true today, is seldom a label that individuals actually claim for themselves, right? But more often, it's a term that's ascribed onto others, and most often with a pejorative context. So there's an interesting exception in Canada, right? Preston Manning has been doing this media tour about kind of rehabilitating populism, right? But generally, people don't self-identify as populist. Right, so I want to suggest that despite this contestability over the term itself, right, we tend to talk about contemporary populism as having three main characteristics. So one, right, we understand populist leaders and movements as responding to a crisis, right? So this crisis can be real, it can be perceived, it can be exaggerated, right? And more likely, it's actually probably a combination of those three things. Right. Second, we understand populism, and this has come out very strongly, I think, in this conference, right, as having and mobilizing a clear rhetorical structure, right? So this binary between the us and the them, right? And then third, and this is somewhat, I think, unique to, the last decade or so, but we often assume and sort of talk about populism as being primarily mobilized around ethnonationalism, right, and nativist sentiments, right? So in a contemporary context, the crisis that most populist leaders seem to or sort of claim to be solving is really a crisis about immigration and migration, right? And so the they in this rhetorical structure are often immigrants and foreigners, right? And then the elitist governments that support them, right? And the us are like real Americans, real Canadians, real Brits, right? And these are key parts of the Brexit movement, of Trump, right? And sort of the rise of right-wing populism generally. Right, and in Canada, I think we saw this sort of narrative about ethno-national populism play out in the 2019 in sort of interesting ways. So as you can see from the headlines, right, this narrative largely revolved around Maxime Bernier, right? And in the media, for example, he was really, before the election, represented as the populist threat, right, because of his anti-immigrant and anti-official multiculturalism position, right? And because he lost, there was sort of this coverage of his loss as like, the populist experiment has failed in Canada, right? And with the defeat of the People's Party, and like we all cheered when Maxime Bernier lost his seat, right? Certainly the room I was in did, right? But sort of with his loss, right, that populism was rejected in Canada. So the argument that I'm going to be making today is that this narrative about contemporary populism as being centered on ethno-nationalism has risked obscured sort of important dimensions about how Canadian populism actually operates in Canada. And perhaps the biggest thing I think that it obscures is that most populist parties and movements in Canada, and certainly the ones that have been and have become sort of potent political forces, have actually not been centered on ethno-nationalism. And this is in part because there are real limits to the electoral viability of anti-immigrant populism in Canada. So caveat, right, like Emily's presentation this morning actually has me thinking, I always thought of sort of nationalism in Quebec as not being populist, right? Anti-immigrant sentiments is a lot more electorally viable in Quebec, and so I'm gonna have to think about whether I think that's populism or not, right? So thank you for that. And so in making this claim, I want to make it really clear that none of the reasons for these limits on anti-immigrant populism are because Canadians are not racist, right? Or that we're less racist, right? Or that Canadians do not hold racist views, right? Rather, Canadian public opinion data consistently demonstrates that the raw ingredients for anti-immigrant or anti-multicultural backlash are indeed very present in Canadian attitudes, right? But at the same time, what we've seen is that there's also this dominant and cross-party narrative about immigrants in Canada, right? And this narrative is that they're important economic contributors, right? And this narrative is mobilized by sort of all of the main parties in Canada, right? And this was clear in Scheer's response to Bernier during the 2019 election, right? And so even the Conservative Party is in support of current immigration rates and official multiculturalism, right? We can think of the Mulroney Conservative government as actually sort of extending official multiculturalism, right? So this, in some ways, puts Canada in somewhat of a unique kind of position, right? And so the question is why, right? If the raw ingredients for anti-immigrant sentiments are indeed present in Canada, right? Why haven't they manifest in political parties, right? Like it has in other countries. And I'm going to point to sort of three reasons for this, three limits to anti-immigrant appeals in Canada, and particularly party politics. So one, right, there's like this basic fact of Canadian geography, right? We're a relatively hard place to get to. We only border one other country, right? And so our remote geographical location means that there are very few, like, to use the term, right, like undocumented migrants, right? Second, right, Canada has a highly selective and highly controlled immigration system, right? In the mid-1960s, there was the introduction of a points-based immigration system that gave priority to newcomers with the education and training required to move reasonably quickly into sort of employment and self-sufficiency, right? And this policy was largely achieved by, again, cross-party consensus that immigrants are needed in Canada, right? Because they can contribute and fill gaps in our economy, right? So in this way, political elites have always recognized Canada's need for immigration, and therefore, regardless of public opinion, they've always had to support and even expand immigration in Canada. Okay, the third reason that I'm going to point to is our electoral system. So I don't know if you all remember the reason that Justin Trudeau gave for not coming through on his promise for electoral reform, right? It was like, oh, we want to like prevent the rise of like racist right-wing parties, right? And like, Justin, right? But there is some element of truth to that, right? In Canada, our single-member plurality system enacts very high barriers for new and small parties, particularly parties with support spread out throughout the country, right? So I think that the Green Party is a really good example of this, right? The Green Party actually enjoys relatively high rates of public support, but because it doesn't have a geographical base, right, they have a really hard time winning seats in Parliament, right? So that's sort of one part of our electoral system, right? The other part is that immigrants actually have often clustered electorally, right? And they're often concentrated in battleground ridings around the country's large urban centers, right? And so this means that they have become an important voter base for parties, right? And much more so than broad, spread out anti-immigrant support. I do work on anti-abortion activism, so like often when I say anti, just abortion comes out of my mouth after. So, but anti-immigrant. Right, so in this way, right, Canada's electoral geography actually makes it difficult to win a majority government without the support of immigrant and minority voters, right? And this has affected the way that parties actually behave, right? Because it's electorally advantaged for parties to like court the immigrant vote, right? Political parties actually prevent the effective sort of partisan mobilization around anti-immigrant attitudes, right? So this isn't to say that we don't see anti-immigrant outbursts in party politics. We certainly do, and we heard of some examples this morning, right? So this like lovely sort of zero barbar practices, right? Language that came out at the end of the 2015 election. Interestingly, right, it was widely condemned, and Harper did lose that election. And then, of course, there's Bernier, right? But even the Conservative Party actually does the best when it reaches out to immigrant communities. And so the only election in Canadian history where the Conservatives have gotten more of the vote in immigrant communities was 2011, right, when they formed majority government. And interestingly, Jason Kenney was behind this. What they got a lot of flack for this, some sort of insider information about the party got leaked, and they termed this strategy ethnic outreach, right? And it was largely Jason Kenney, of all people, who was Minister of Immigration at the time, who sort of coordinated this. There's a really, for those, Alberta, right? There's a really interesting, now it's old, but piece in The Walrus about how Jason Kenney sort of engineered this for the Conservative Party at the federal level. So it's not just that dominant narratives of contemporary populism as sort of anti-immigrant, xenophobic, and centered on ethnonationalism. It's not just that they don't account for the limits of anti-immigrant politics in Canada. It actually overlooks the actual history of populist politics and rhetoric in Canada. And so I think when I give these types of talks to like my students in Montreal, for example, they're like somewhat surprised about the history, but I'm here in Alberta, so I know you are all probably more aware of sort of the history of, in particular, Western-based populism in the country. Right, so it overlooks this history and a number of characteristics in a few ways. And in particular, I'm going to argue that there are kind of 4 key characteristics that are obscured by this kind of focus on ethno-national populism. So the first is, right, the actual history of populism in Canada, right? The most potent, powerful political forces in our country on both the right and the left have emerged in the prairie provinces, right? And a lot of them have been centered on feelings of Western alienation. And again, this has been true on the left and the right, right? So the CCF is a good example of this. This is a party, a socialist, labor, populist party, right? Its origins are in agrarian socialism, right? It was formed after the Great Depression because Ottawa wasn't taking the experience of prairie farmers seriously, right? And so this is sort of one example on the left, right? And then on the right, of course, we have sort of similar but very different rationales from like Preston Manning and the rise of the Reform Party, right? So I think that if we actually keep this history of the Western origins of populism in Canada in mind, right, we actually see a very different narrative about the federal election arise, right? And this is a narrative, not that populism was defeated with the defeat of Bernier, but rather that the 2019 election results are actually a tinderbox for populism, right? So this is these are the 2019 results. We're right there in that tiny orange dot that you can't even see, right? So I'm excited to be here, right? But you can see that this is a country divided, right? That the western part of the country voted in a different way than the rest of the country, right? And so actually what this might be telling us is that the results of the 2019 election are actually going to spark populism in Canada. And, of course, you all live in Alberta, so you know this, right? That's exactly what we see happening. Right, we see it in the Wexit movement, this Republic of Alberta t-shirt. I've actually had a t-shirt with that logo, but it's like 2 rifles. I've had it forever, and I wear it often in Quebec. Right? My students love it, yeah. Right, so we're seeing evidence of it in the form of Wexit. We're also seeing evidence of it, right, in Jason Kenney. Right, so we're seeing Jason Kenney mobilize many of the characteristics of this populist rhetorical structure that I was talking about, right? He uses a lot of us versus them language, right? But we also see a lot of overlap with previous forms of Western prairie populism, right? So on an institutional level, for example, right, his appeals to referendums as a political tool, right? The referendum, which lets the people decide, is a tool that's often invoked by populist leaders, right? Particularly in Canada. And the other thing that I have loved to watch is I lived in Ottawa for most of the Harper government's tenure, and so I followed Jason Kenney pretty closely, right? And he talks completely differently now, right? He talked very much like a politician politician, like elite, right? And now we hear him kind of using this like folksy heartland kind of language, right? So this is like a screenshot of his Instagram, and I just loved it, right? Like, people have a bloody right to be frustrated in this province. We darn well better get to the bottom of it, right? So he's even invoking kind of this like prairie politics persona, which like is not authentic to sort of who he is or how he has spoken for most of his life. All right. So a second sort of important characteristic of Canadian populism that I think is obscured by this focus on ethno-national populism is the real dominance of market populism in Canada. Right? So market populism is this term that was coined by Thomas Frank in the United States to track what was happening in the Republican and Democratic Party throughout the early 2000s. And it's this sort of notion that the free market is more democratic than any democracy, right? And we can think of like Adam Smith's invisible hand, right? And according to this logic, any interference in the market, right, through taxation, through the redistribution of wealth, right, it represents an elitist violation of the people, right? And this is a very dominant form of populism in Canada, right? And certainly has been very dominant since the merging of the right at the federal level in the early 2000s, right? So we can think of think tanks like the Fraser Institute and the Manning Center, right, as well as most conservative politicians in the country who are sort of key champions of this type of market populist rhetoric, right? And interestingly, there's some new work from Shane Gunster at Simon Fraser University, and he uses this term, hold on, let me find it. It's extractive populism. And so he actually looks at how market populism is now fusing with sort of advocacy for oil and gas extractions. And his work is really interesting sort of on this dimension. Okay, third, and this is the part of my presentation which might, I don't know, it either complements or doesn't complement your presentation, but I think it does complement, right? Which is that populism in Canada has often been mobilized against Quebec, against francophones, against official bilingualism, right? So I've started to do some archival research around Reform Party documents, and the Reform Party often use like, we need to fight French power to refer to Ottawa, right? And we're certainly seeing Jason Kenney mobilize this type of rhetoric, right? Right, the pick a lane, what a phrase. Pick a lane on equalization payments. And not that he was like completely unprovoked in responding to Blanchette the other day, but he certainly did, right? And even using this language of arrogance to describe Quebec, right? This has been sort of an enduring characteristic of populism in Canada. And interestingly, it's actually not only unique to Western Canada. So some of the other work that I've been doing is actually tracking the rise of a new populist party in New Brunswick, who is like almost entirely centered on opposing official bilingualism in the province, and does so by mobilizing really sort of strong populist messages. New Brunswick is like this unique context where it actually might be kind of the only bilingual province in the country, right? Okay, but what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my presentation today is what I think is the rise of a really important form of populism, and that is penal populism. All right, so what is penal populism, right? Like other forms of populist rhetoric, penal populism speaks to the perspective that we must get tough on crime because crime victims and Canadian communities, right, the us in this rhetorical structure, have been victimized by dangerous and overprivileged criminals, right, the them and the governments that enable them. Right, and over the last 3 decades, we've witnessed a global rise of penal populism, particularly in the US and the UK. And discourses of penal populism tend to promote the notion that, and I mean, this is a largely dispelled notion. Criminologists have done a very good job of showing the ways that this is not true, right? But the discourses of penal populism promote this notion that the tougher the punishment for a crime, right, the less likely that crime will be to occur. Right, so some of the central policy and legislative tools of penal populism tend to be the adoption of really punitive law and order measures, measures, right? So the introduction of mandatory minimum sentencing, limiting judicial discretion in sentencing, right? Increasing funding and resources for policing and police, trends like trying juveniles as adults, and increasing maximum sentences. Right, so I think that this is a really important trend that we should be looking at in Canada for a few different reasons. So one, this is actually a relatively new phenomenon within Conservative Party politics in Canada. So it happened a little bit at the provincial level in the 90s, right? But at the federal level, this is really new. So as opposed to other countries like the US and the UK, Canada has actually had relatively stable levels of incarceration since the 19th century, right? Still sort of very racist, forms of incarceration, but moderate compared to other countries, lower incarceration rates. And this was largely due to the fact that for most of Canadian history, its approach to criminal justice policy has been based on two main tenets. So one, it's viewed prison as a last resort, and two, it's considered criminality largely to be the result of social circumstance and not as individually determined, right? And moreover, Canada's kind of more compassionate approach to criminal justice has been historically consistent, and there's been significant agreement between political parties in favor of its merit. So I also have started to do some archival research in this, and I've actually found Liberal and Conservative governments using identical policies in terms of criminal justice and just replacing the party logo on the same document, right? So until 2006, right, Conservative parties and Liberal parties really governed in the same way when it came to criminal justice, right? But this more moderate approach was sidelined, and a more punitive one sort of came in 2006 with the election of Stephen Harper. So Harper, he campaigned on this. When he was a Conservative activist, this was one of his things as well, and he governed on sort of penal populist, both like legislative tools and rhetorics, right? So for example, right, in 2012, Harper, and I'm sure many of you remember this, introduced a very comprehensive omnibus bill, right, which hardened Canada's responses to crime quite significantly. Most controversial was his introduction of mandatory minimum sentencing for things like marijuana possession, right? This was very controversial at the time, right? And this has ushered in a new era of conservative law and order and sort of increasingly punitive crime policy. So interestingly, because of this shift within the Conservative Party, the other parties have also shifted to the right on these issues as well. So starting in 2011, for example, the NDP was campaigning on increasing funding to police, right? So we've seen this kind of reflected in the other parties as well. Okay, but second, my research is increasingly showing that this is a shifting terrain even within Conservative Party politics. And so actually what I've seen is really big differences in the way that the Stephen Harper government invoked and mobilized penal populism and the way that the Andrew Scheer government does. And what I found is that Harper really relied on market populism to make these arguments. So it was about, like the overburdened taxpayer having to pay for criminals and like these types of things, right? The emotional costs of crime. But it was rare that it was explicitly or even implicitly racialized, right? But what I found with the Scheer Conservative government, and I'm going to talk about it now, is that he's invoking sort of bolder logics of penal populism and ones that I believe are sort of deeply racialized in problematic ways. Right, so third, I think that the rise of penal populism is interesting might be the wrong word, disturbing, right? Because I found that penal populist narratives tend to rely on racialized logics and rhetoric that are actually very familiar to other forms of populism, and in particular, ethnonational populism, right? So they're very similar narratives addressing sort of a different crisis or problem. So one thing that I've noticed sort of over the last 2 years and actually over the last 2 weeks is that there's been a huge uptick in conservative discourse about rural crime. Okay, and what's emerged across the country at both at the federal level and then now at the provincial level is a pretty clear penal populist narrative that tells an interconnected story about victimized, innocent, law-abiding rural communities and increasing levels of gang violence, right? So the rest of my presentation is going to do a little bit of a deconstruction of the emergence and contours of this new kind of rural crime narrative. So this is part of a larger project, and this is very preliminary. And I'm just going to present one part of a paper that I have that examined every mention of rural crime in the House of Commons since the early 1990s. And so my analysis uncovered many interesting things, but maybe there's sort of two really interesting ones, which is one, the emergence of discussions of rural crime are like surprisingly new. And two, that these narratives, and I said this right, draw on surprisingly bold racial logics. All right, so before getting into this analysis, a few things that I want to mention about the issue of rural crime. All right, so it is true, rural communities in Canada do face higher rates of crime. This is particularly true in the prairie provinces. In Alberta, rural crime is about 38% more common than in cities. This is particularly referring to property crime. And in the House of Commons, some Conservative MPs actually do contribute thoughtfully to this problem, right? So that sort of should be said. Right. Second, prior to 2018, rural crime was not an issue for the Conservative Party. Okay, interestingly, the first government to bring it up was the NDP government in Alberta. And so in terms of Conservative Party politics, it just was not an issue. It was not central to any of the party's electoral platforms. And this surprised me. The phrase rural crime appears exactly one time in parliamentary debates between 2003 and 2016, right? 2003 being the year that the right merged, right? And so this is made even more surprising because I was just telling you that Harper, governed on these tough on crime, penal populist sort of trends, right? But in all of his campaigning, in all of the debate over Bill C-10, which was this crime legislation, never once was the term rural crime brought up. All right, but this is the most pathetic visual. I'm sorry, it was last minute, okay, but whatever. I know, I need a better graph. I know. So I actually even thought about deleting it, whatever, okay. So starting in February 2018, we see a huge uptick in appeals to rural crime in the House. And in 2018 alone, so one mention before 2018, right? In 2018 alone, MPs refer to rural crime in 78 separate parliamentary speeches, right? And there's no bill being debated in the House about rural crime, right? They're bringing it in when they're debating other bills. Right, so another interesting dimension of this uptick is that the mobilization of the issue of rural crime seems to be connected to events that were occurring in the background of electoral politics. Again, right, prior to February 2018, we only see one mention, right? But one thing that's happening in the background is the trial of Gerald Stanley, who was charged in the shooting of Colton Boushie. Okay, so I think we know this story well. Gerald Stanley was a rural Canadian, right? He was tried for the second-degree murder of Boushie, an Indigenous teenager from Cree Red Pheasant First Nation, who was found on Stanley's property. Stanley shot him in his car, right? Stanley was found not guilty by a jury that included no Indigenous members, and this decision sparked outrage, but also support across the country. Okay, so consider this again, right? So prior to February 2018, we see no mentions of rural crime. In the 2 weeks following the announcement of the verdict, we see MPs raise the issue of rural crime 17 times in the House, right? Often speaking at great length and completely unprovoked. So they'll be talking about like procedural issues, and they'll bring up the issue of rural crime, right? So given the high-profile nature of Stanley's trial and the subsequent nationwide nationwide protests against the verdict, I believe that many Canadians might have already been primed to see rural crime along racial and colonial lines. And I think that this is sort of a key part to its populist rhetorical appeal. All right, sorry. So, what are the populist sort of underpinnings of this argument, right? And why should we consider it to be populism? So interestingly, the opportunity for the Conservative Party to speak about rural crime most commonly took the form of opposition to Bill C-71, which was a Liberal government-tabled bill that introduced new provisions to enhance background checks for those seeking firearm licenses. And so it's not a surprise that the Conservative Party opposed this bill, but it largely mobilized a narrative around rural crime to do so. Right, and I want to argue that this narrative about rural crime invokes very familiar populist appeals, right? And it does so in a few different ways. So first, conservatives present rural crime as a crisis, right? This is a common thing within populist rhetoric, right? In the House, Conservatives MPs repeatedly stress that crime is rising in rural communities, right, which is true. And many make this point by drawing on very sort of bold and perhaps exaggerated logics. So rural crime is presented as, and these are all quotes, a regular occurrence, as dramatically surging, as a grave threat to the safety of our communities, right? And this is supplemented by interventions that present rural Canadian as under a sort of siege. So here's one example, right? Farm families are becoming more and more anxious in the last few years about the safety of their children playing in the yard in broad daylight or being woken up in the dead of the night by an intruder in their yard or in their home or business, right? I haven't heard any accounts of children being attacked in their yards, right? So there's good reason to believe, right, that this is an exaggeration of a serious problem, right, which sort of confirms that it might be a form of kind of important populist rhetoric that we should be paying attention to. Okay, second, right, conservative MPs also mobilize this clear us versus them rhetorical structure, right? So there's maybe two thems in this story, right? First and most significantly, there's a story of dangerous and evil, and yes, a couple of MPs do use the term evil, criminals who are preying on rural communities, right? And conservative MPs seemed, and this is new, right? I did not see this. I mean, I've read like every parliamentary intervention about crime, and I didn't see this in the Harper era. But what I found in 2018 is that MPs were more than willing to pepper their parliamentary speeches with popular and deeply racialized dog whistles, right? So, for example, the term inner city only appears once, but the term gang is mentioned a stunning 120 times in these discussions, and urban crime 25 times, right? These are well recognized, particularly American dog whistles, right? So what's a dog whistle? I mean, like a dog whistle technically is a whistle you blow and only dogs can hear it, right? And so when that's applied to politics, right, it's a phrase that is only recognized by certain parts or segments of the population, right? So in the US, for example, evangelical politicians have used the dog whistle quite effectively. So Papa George Bush, so George Bush Sr., often would use the term wonder working power, right? This is a term that, I mean, like, I am not religious, so like I would not recognize that, right? But within evangelical communities, this holds sort of deep significance, right? So it's a way for him to speak to that community, right, without making it explicit for other people. Right, but more often, dog whistles operate largely through unconscious processes that activate associations, for example, between race and crime, without it happening at the level of sort of formal consciousness. Right, so research in political psychology has consistently showed that phrases like inner city, thug, urban crime, or even the word crime itself very effectively trigger racial thinking, even when race is not explicitly referred to or invoked, right? So inner city, urban crime, right, thugs, these aren't necessarily on the surface racialized, but the literature suggests that the way that they operate, right, is certainly racialized. Okay, so these dog whistles, right, are supplemented by other arguments that link sort of complicit complicity, thank you, in gang violence with like out-of-touch liberal elites, right, which is also a key component of populist rhetoric. My favorite thing that I found was that 4 times throughout the debate, separate conservative MPs refer to liberals as hug-a-thug liberals, like hug-a-thug liberals. Like, can you imagine saying that in the House of Commons without laughing, right? It also got picked up by, of course, none other than the Toronto Sun, right? So we see this them part of the rhetorical sort of strategy, right? So if thugs and liberals, hug-a-thug liberals, right, are the them in this populist story, who are the us? So I also want to suggest that more than simply triggering racialized stereotypes about crime and criminals, that in the construction of us, right, in this construction of the people, the rural people, right, that conservatives are also activating familiar perceptions about white innocence and white vulnerability, right? So the first indication that this is happening is that the terms gang, right, inner city, urban crime are almost always juxtaposed with law-abiding, ordinary, hardworking Canadians, right? So almost on par with gangs, the term law-abiding appears 115 times throughout these speeches, right? So we can see here, this is a long quote, I'll just read the last part of it. We can see here how this plays out, right? So liberals need to stop focusing their firearm regulations on law-abiding farmers, hunters, and northern Canadians, right? And focus it on felons, on gangs, and on the flow of illegal guns across the border, right? This is a bold racial logic, right? And through this juxtaposition, right, they're making sort of a racialized argument. Right, so I want to suggest that this contrast between law-abiding, rural Canadians in the heartland of the country, right, and gangs and criminals rely on, implicitly and sometimes pretty explicit racialized arguments. And in fact, some of the Conservative Party's framing of rural crime, I think, strongly echoes some of the arguments that we've heard, for example, from Donald Trump about immigrants and Mexican immigrants in particular, right? This invoking of sort of the border, right? So I think it takes up very familiar sort of forms, right? But is not centered on immigration. Okay, one final thing that I wanted to mention. I study gender and conservative politics as well, right? And so one thing that's kind of missing from this narrative that I think is important to point out, right? For instance, there are no references to domestic or intimate partner abuse, even though we know that this is on the rise, particularly for rural women. This was true in the Harper era, and it's also true, right? So like the Harper era, like we're cracking down on crime, but like we don't consider sexual assault to be crime, right? Or violence against trans communities, for example, right? So we know that rural women face additional barriers in leaving abusive relationships, right? Fewer shelters, fewer resources, no close neighbors, right? But the us in this populist story, right, is very much a male us, a gun-toting male us, right? And in fact, every single story about rural crime recounted in the House, and we know how MPs love to recount stories, right, described men as being victimized by crime, right? Not women, sometimes families, but not women, right? So even though gender might not be an explicit part of the sort of construction of the us, I would suggest that gender still underpins how this narrative functions, right? And implicit in this logic, it's really men who are the law-abiding, gun-owning, sort of ordinary tax-paying Canadians to whom conservatives are appealing. All right, so I hope what I've made clear, right, is that this narrative around gun control and rural crime draws on at least 2 implicit and barely disguised racial logics that are very familiar to anti-immigrant populist rhetoric as well, right? So one, it's responding to and probably exaggerating a crisis. Did I say 2? I meant 1, right? And 2, right, it mobilizes an us versus them racialized logic, right? And the timing of this debate, right, following the Boushie verdict, also gives us good reason to believe that Canadians were already primed to understand rural crime along racialized lines. Right. Finally, this is also a narrative that is becoming increasingly popular throughout the country. So Scheer's tough on crime credentials were prominently featured on his website. On the page that he did it, I did like a quick search. So it's just like one page where he's talking about how he's tough on crime, and he mentions gang like 30 times in one web page, right? But we're also, I mean, this is a very sort of live issue. We saw, I think it was last week, right, that Jason Kenney announced that he was going to act on this. Interestingly, he announced that he was going to act on this after he reversed what the Notley government had done. So this is also sort of interesting, right? We're seeing the same thing in Manitoba, right? And so I think that this is going to be sort of an increasingly salient populist argument. All right, so in conclusion, right, the kind of big takeaways from today, right? Populism is alive and well in Canada and in Canadian politics, right? But it is also taking uniquely Canadian forms, right? It tends to avoid anti-immigrant or ethnonational populism, but rather it's Western-based and it's neoliberal, and it's also increasingly penal populist, right? So I think we need to consider that populism is a context-specific phenomenon, right? That it has a restricted morphology that can only attach itself to particular national debates, contexts, and in Canada's case, our sort of racist and colonial legacy. Thank you. Sorry, I went over, didn't I?
Whoosh. Where does one begin? I'm sure many people have questions for you, especially given what's going on in Alberta right now. You've kind of nailed it in a lot of ways, Kelly. So I think we should just open the floor to questions. We'll have about 20 minutes for questions, 15 to 20 minutes, and we have 2 microphones that are roving, one here and I don't know where the other one is. Oh, there it is. Okay, and so if you would like to ask a question, please just raise your hands. And just as we're doing that, I was going to just ask Kelly, it's a little bit off topic, about Bill 207, which, and I just wondered if you had any, we spoke about it briefly beforehand, she's familiar with the bill, if you have any information or points of view on how far you think that bill is going to go. In Canada, do you think we have or in Alberta, I should say, is there any chance that you think it will actually go through, pass?
It's like, we were talking a little bit about this before, and it's such a good question. So I study anti-abortion politics as well, right? Conscience rights, kind of private members' bills are incredibly common in Canada at the federal level and at the provincial levels. None have actually passed in Canada. And so I have no idea, right? Like Jason Kenney, Jason Kenney started his career as an anti-abortion activist in Saskatchewan, right? So we know what his personal feelings are. I always consider Kenney a little bit of like a Harper conservative, right? So if he's following the Harper line, he's going to shut down this bill. So my mom works at Kensington Clinic in Calgary, which is the standalone abortion clinic there, and we have a bet. And she says absolutely it's going to pass, and I said no. So we'll see if it actually does. I mean, I don't think if it doesn't pass, it's not because there's not support within the party for it, right? It's that they don't think that it's electorally viable and that it risks painting the party like as even more radical than it already is, right? Yeah. But I'm also happy to talk about that if that's, I know that there was a protest this afternoon here.
Fellow up there, yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay over there? Yeah. I'm just wondering your thoughts on the approach of conservative parties, maybe the UCP in particular, with respect to addictions and mental health, and the populism, as you said, against using rural crime as a strategy. And I just there's a quote from Jason Kenney in July in the Calgary Herald with regards to not proceeding with additional safe consumption sites, saying, quote, "I am listening to the residents of the Beltline whose neighborhood has become riddled with crime, with antisocial behavior, with harassment of innocent law-abiding citizens." That was with respect to a safe consumption site.
Yeah. Are we gonna take a few questions, or?
If that's
I think in other sessions they've taken 3. So
okay,
maybe
so
3 questions.
Right there.
Yeah.
So that fellow there, and then this,
Hi, my name's William, and as part of the Alberta Advantage podcast, we've done a lot about populism and the history of it in the prairie provinces. So my question was, so you've talked a lot about the contemporary right populism and its likely future increase here in Canada, which is an assessment I agree with. But is there a possibility of a return of a left populism like there has been in the past in Canada?
Yeah, good question.
And this we'll just do 3 there, and then we'll come to this side.
I don't have a question. I was just going to say I've heard from UCP members that the Conscious Rights Bill he supports. That was an idea 3 years ago he had. So even though the private member bill might not pass, he totally supports it.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. He goes to conservative events and talks about, I mean, he often frames it as like religious conscience, right? Like, and freedom of religion. But no. Like, I'm not talking about Jason Kenney's personal beliefs. I think those are very clear,
but so I think going forward, that's something we have to talk about, because it's fine to have our personal views, but it's very dangerous when these now become our laws.
Oh, absolutely.
And so if this is our premier, we need to watch out for that. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got 3 there.
Okay, so sorry. Okay, so the first question or the second question about left-wing populism. I don't study left-wing politics, right? I should, because it probably would be more pleasant, but I don't. Right? So I think that maybe you know better than me. I mean, I think certainly Notley, and I mean, at least to some sort of success, right, appealed to these populist sentiments as well. But I don't think I'm like the person that's most positioned to sort of answer that question, because I spend like all my time with conservatives. So yeah. The question of safe consumption states, thank you for that question, because this is like a really new project. So I felt actually quite nervous about presenting it here. But I think that this is a really actually interesting link, right, about how it's happening around rural crime and how it's actually probably also happening around safe consumption sites. So, right, he's mobilizing a very similar rhetoric. And so I imagine these things are very connected, right? The question of like, the opioid crisis, for example, right? I think this goes to how the crisis of rural crime is being constructed and the things that are omitted from that narrative, right? And I think that addiction is something that's omitted by that narrative, right? And that was true with the Harper government, and it's certainly true with the Scheer Conservative Party, and I think it's going to be true in how this plays out at the provincial level as well. Yeah.
Okay, so let's take some questions on this side then. Go ahead.
Okay, my name's Johnny, and I'm a gun-toting male rural Albertan.
Welcome!
I also happen to be probably one of the only progressives in my whole county. But when I go down to the Legion or Tim Hortons in town to talk about politics, because it's fun. It's my hobby.
I would really like to join you.
I find out exactly how the dog whistle of rural crime is working out there. Because I say, well, what do you think about all this rural crime stuff? And they tell me, well, it's because they're letting so many new immigrants in from Muslim countries. They did it in Sweden, and now it's happening here.
I mean,
so that isn't an ethno-nationalist dog whistle policy that the right wing is getting away with because they have a new name for it now. Or else they'll tell me, well, how close to the reserve do you live determines how much rural crime you got.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that
these are honest comments.
Yeah,
these are retired farmers.
Yeah. This is such a good point, right? And I think, the thing about a dog whistle, and this is what I was a little bit worried about, like the anti-immigration thing, right? That they can stoke anti-immigrant sentiment without referring to it, right? So, and that's how effective these dog whistles are, and that's how it's operating, right? In that quote that mentions borders, right? When you mention illegal and borders in the same sentence, right? It's invoking these sentiments, and so that's one. I actually would really like to join you one day. So let's exchange information. I'm planning on coming to spend some time in rural Alberta. So, and I think you're spot on. Yeah.
There's a question here.
Do you have If you have the mic, we can start here. And then
Sure. I was just going to ask if you could compare how populist right-wing politicians invoke white innocence with how ostensibly left-wing neoliberal politicians invoke cis feminine innocence in the context of Bill C-51 and a focus on female-assigned domestic and intimate partner violence survivors, who are the minority of domestic violence intimate partner survivors. And I'll say it until you treat our bodies with some seriousness, folks.
Yeah, it's a great. So I mean, it's a really. I'm sure that there's sort of parallels between those sort of invocations. Yeah.
Is secular society a dog whistle for anti-immigration?
Sorry, say that again.
Is secular society a dog whistle for anti-immigration?
So I think it depends on the so I mean, my point about dog whistles would actually be very similar to my point about populism, right? Which is like dog whistle. So another dog whistle that I've been looking at is like this case of Terry McClintock, which is this really I'm not even going to get into it. It's complicated, right? But like, I think it operates as like a dog whistle to sort of like indigeneity, right? And so I think that we also have to understand dog whistling as being very context specific, right? So a dog whistle that works in one place might not work in another, right? And so secularism, I don't think is a dog whistle in English Canada, right? But it might be, like laïcité might be a dog whistle in Quebec, for example, or in France, right? So I think it certainly could operate that way.
There's a question here. This man. Okay.
So perhaps it's true that there hasn't been an appetite within political populism to use anti-immigrant sentiment, but it does seem that there is some sort of appetite for that. Certainly, I'm thinking about rebel media in particular, and even after the whole Faith Goldie debacle down in Charlottesville, I know they've had an increase in their crowdfunding for sure. I don't know what their subscription is. I'm assuming it's increased. And I know that their main stick, apart from climate change denial and all that stuff, is this kind of anti-Muslim sort of thing. Can you parse that a little bit? So where is this? Is it growing? Is it kind of spread out across the country? What are your thoughts on that?
So scholars typically talk about sort of anti-immigrant sentiment in Canada as being like the rule of thirds, right? So public opinion polling normally shows that sort of a third of Canadians are for increasing immigration, a third are like, we're good where we are, and a third, and that third, depending on how you frame the argument, can go either way, right? And then there's a third, I can't remember what thirds I talked about, there's a third that wants to decrease, like anti-immigrant, right? And so what I'm talking about, like, right, the raw ingredients for anti-immigrant populism are indeed present in Canada, right? And they're probably actively being stoked by places like Rebel News and on Twitter, right? Which I just learned is like incredibly organized on the right, so that's a bummer, right? My point was, right, there's a real limit to its electoral viability, and particularly on a federal level, right? So I think your very point that it's spread out throughout the country makes, and I also think like we have this dominant narrative about like Canada welcoming immigrants and being multicultural, right? And this is a narrative that exists in the Conservative Party like it does in the Liberal Party. And so, like this narrative, sort of our electoral system, it's not that these attitudes are not present, right? We know that they are, but they're not. We're not seeing them sort of affect electoral politics in the same way as we are in other countries. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So do you see it increasing perhaps to the point where it reaches do start to see it in federal politics?
So I mean, on that, I think that like what happened to Maxime Bernier is actually sort of an interesting example, right? It seems like there's real limits to that, right? He was popular in his riding, and he did not win his seat, right? His riding is. It's like Quebec, like northern, like near Quebec City, right? So if there was kind of an area where that might be a viable argument, you would think that he would maybe win his seat. But like, it was a non-starter, the People's Party. So I don't don't know that we're going to see a huge shift in electoral politics. I mean, interestingly, the times that we see it come out, I mean, we saw it in the Conservative leadership race with Kelly Leach, and we saw it like once Stephen Harper was like losing the 2015 election, he seemed to throw out all of these anti-immigrant dog whistles to try to like rile up his base, right? And I don't think it necessarily was very effective. But this is, we do see anti-immigrant outbursts in partisan politics, right? But they're often sort of in these contexts.
Now, there are a whole number of people who have questions here, and I know I've been focusing on this side, but this gentleman's been having his hand up for some time, so I'm just going to take his question
won't
and
take
we'll
long.
move over here. Yeah.
Crime must be rather minor part of populism, but we've discussed it a lot. But in that context, no one's mentioned the phenomenon which is not dead, restorative justice, which has had a rough start in Canada, and it's certainly had a rough start in conservative provinces.
Yeah. I mean, so this might be like an interesting counterpart, like some kind of resistance to narratives of penal populism, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Somebody from a rural area, like I'm from Spirit River Rycroft area.
Okay.
I just wanted to point out that I think the national narrative on rural crime is very separated from an actual reality. Like, as you pointed out, it was stoked by the Gerald Boucher incident. Because I know, as somebody from the Central Peace Country, we started getting concerned about rural crime in that area around whenever the price of oil dropped, which I believe was around 2015-ish, because of course then a lot of oil people who often didn't manage their money well, they didn't make it lots, and often maybe also had cocaine problems or such. Like lots of those people end up in hard times, and like I remember in 2015, so many people had their trucks stolen and stuff, and ever since there's been, I would say actually in the Central Peace Country, like I obviously don't know the statistics, but that actually there, it's been, you can tell there's a couple people get their trucks stolen at spring breakup, but it's been dimming down every single year. So yeah, I just wanted to point out that, like, I think the narrative on rural crime is very, very, very separated from the reality. Otherwise, at least in Western Canada, the narrative would have started in 2015. Also, another point I just wanted to highlight was that I feel like a lot of rural people just need to be taught a bit more compassion when it comes to natives, because a lot of them, like I remember when talking to my father, he didn't actually understand that like when he was a kid, that natives weren't and he was born like 58, that Aboriginals were not allowed to leave the reserves without permission. So a lot of people don't understand that, because it's unfortunately somewhat true that people who live near reserves do end up getting a lot of crime from the reserve, but they don't understand that there's a reason why those communities have been put in a bad spot, and it's not just a lot of individuals making bad decisions.
Yeah, thank you. Those are, yeah.
Now, was there another question here? Sorry.
Just building on that, it seems to me that systemic racism is part and parcel of Canadian populism, even if it's not explicitly. And people have given examples of the anti-immigrant bias, Islamophobia, and other kinds of xenophobia. I'm thinking also when I was at the University of Lethbridge, we did a research project there, everyday racism, particularly as experienced by Blackfoot people. And Blackfoot students went and documented the examples and cases. And I'm thinking with the rural crime, we shouldn't underplay the extent to which that racism is part of it, because you have this narrative of the farmer protecting his private property.
I really hope that's not what I was doing. I think I was trying to make the opposite point, right? Which is absolutely, like, I think we look for racialized populism on this level of anti-immigrant, right? And when we don't find it, we say, oh my God, look, we're like so not racist in Canada, like we love immigrants, right? And my point is that populism is springing up in other policy areas in ways that are heavily racialized and mirror ethnonational populism, right?
Even the penal populism, when you look at the high proportion of Aboriginal people in prison,
absolutely.
So it seems to me it needs to be integrated into the analysis at every level. That's what I would suggest.
Is there a...
Hello. So So it's me here, right? So I'm Brown. I came here like 10 years ago, and right now, so Conservative Party is kind of anti-immigrant, but right now to win election in Canada, you have to win GTA, you have to win 905, and most of the people there are people of color, right? So what do you think in next 5 years or 10 years, the way Conservative, right now, they're really their base with anti-immigrant, so I think it will change in next 5 or 10 years, right? As like you can't form the government if you don't win GTA and Toronto, Vancouver, and the people in those cities are people of color, right? So what do you think? The way Conservative do their politics, will it change in next 5 years, 10 years?
Sorry, do I think that the party will change in what way?
So like right now they're kind of anti-immigrants when they talk, like their rural MPs are like anti-immigrants, right? When they talk, like all the dog whistle, what do you think it will change as a party?
So like my argument is that so look, there are anti-immigrant dog whistles that happen within the Conservative Party, but they're sanitized from official party discourse, right? Because that's exactly it, right? The Conservatives know that they have to win the GTA, right? And they did not this election, right? And so that has already started changing, right? And interestingly, Kenny was like a pivotal part of that change within the Conservative Party under Stephen Harper, right? So I think that change is already occurring.
Are there any other questions?
I just wanted to comment on the privatization of prisons.
Could you just hang on one sec so we can get your question? Yeah, no, go ahead.
When you brought up the differences between the issue in the states, I just think the privatization of prisons has just, skyrocketed.
I mean, that's starting to happen in Canada as well. Yeah.
Thanks for that talk. I just wanted to mention that the Tasha Hubbard's film on Colton Bushey just played in Lethbridge, and it was remarkable how full that room was. And so I feel living there and working with a lot of Blackfoot collaborators, I feel an incredible sense of optimism about the activism that's going on in that city in particular. And I agree with the gentleman who reflected on the safe injection side as, that's the dog whistle for the opioid crisis in Lethbridge is the dog whistle for Indigenous so-called crime. And there's already building, there's been attacks on people working and using the sites there. But the city has been very quick to respond. And so even the police force and organizations like the Sage Patrol, there's a lot of activism going on and counter protests against closing, changing the safe injection site arches. So I actually think that the rise in I guess just the activism from the ground, Indigenous activism on the ground and alliances that are building there offers great optimism for me, although I don't know how everyone will combat whatever comes out of the Kenney government around that, because of course they do play politically to the small rural and religiously conservative groups who are very vocal. So
thank you. It's nice to sort of end on a positive note. I think we're at the end of our questions. Was there anyone else? Okay, so one more. Oh well, how could we not take a question from Gordon Laxer? I'll say this will be our last question.
Yes, is the mic on? Good. Yeah, very good, your analysis. I'm interested in the relationship between populism and nationalism, and why the right populists have not been using ethnonationalism as much in Canada. Well, I mean, historically, if you look at before the Second World War, the Conservatives used ethnic nationalism, with a tie with Britain. When the Cold War starts, then Canada, the right is saying Canada has to be working with the United States against the communist threat. The left becomes the economic nationalists. They will not not racial nationalists. And the conservatives were saying, if you express Canadian independent support for that and against foreign ownership, then you were being anti-American. And so the conservatives would say, we have to, because of trade, integrate into the United States, and that would bring in privatization and right-wing policies, and then the left was against that, and the left was anti-racist, and they wouldn't use racist themes. When Obama was elected in 2008, and then we had Harper in Canada, then the Canadian politics was more conservative than the U.S. was. And so anyways, this has a big effect on what kind of narrative you can use. Also the fact that in many countries, the main traditional enemy is somebody, a neighboring country with a different ethnic group. We don't have that in Canada. So this is, I think, a fourth point when you made the 3 points about why we have not had the right has not used nationalism in the ethnic nationalism as much. Just to add to your
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and the fact that the one country that we border is the United States, who we might want to actually be. So, right? Yeah. Thank you for those comments. Sorry. Sure.
Well, okay, folks, we're at the end of our time. Thank you very much for your engagement. And I just want to thank Professor Gordon for a really stimulating and interesting discussion about something that is affecting all of us. So on behalf of the board, thank you very much. Now, folks, just before you leave, I just want you to know that there is an event, and I've been asked to invite you to join the conference organizers at Dewey's. There will be 2 of Edmonton's finest spoken word artists there. Just follow the crowd. It's a short walk across campus, and or you can follow the directional signs in reverse.